welcome. We're excited to have you. And if you're joining us here today, chances are you have some curiosity about how you can navigate our city and state government here in New York. Again, we have some folks from across the country, so hopefully you'll learn a couple of tips about what goes on in New York here, and maybe you can bring them back home to your community as well. But again, there's a lot we could talk about here. You could spend a month just talking about the ins and outs of city and state government. So there's a lot that we can talk about. There is a lot that we're going to cover. And again, I encourage you all to feel free to use the Q&A function. You should see at the bottom of your screen a little button that says Q&A. You can add any of your questions for the YI team there. Feel free to also just drop them in the chat as well, and someone on our team will flag those for me, and I'll do my best to answer those questions. But again, feel free to sort of ask those questions throughout. And if anything needs extra explanation, I'm happy to do so. So, questions, we encourage them early and often, so feel free to drop those in there as well. And yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. So city and state government. So first, I think it's really important to make sure we're all on the same page about why any of this matters at all. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? And maybe you have some of your own, or what made you want to come out to this webinar in general. Feel free to add in the chat some of the reasons there. But I know that for me, at least, to me, this kind of information matters because as we'll talk about today, decisions are being made all the time that impact our lives, that impact our campuses, they impact our families, our friends, our communities, our borough, our city, wherever you live. There's decisions every single day that are being made that impact your life and the life of the people that you care about. And it's not always easy to understand these processes. And there's a lot of ways where even, in a democracy where folks should be able to have access to, all of these important decisions, it can be really confusing. It can be really challenging. And at least in my experience, this wasn't something that I was really taught in schools, right? I might have been told about, how to vote or things like that, but I didn't really learn a lot about how I could navigate my own government that, again, works for me. And so, we think it's really important to equip folks, especially young folks who've been historically left out of decision-making processes. We think it's important to share that information and to make sure that, again, if this is something that you want to be a part of, you have that information. Another reason that all of this matters is because this is one way to really join the fight for social justice and join folks who are really pushing for equity across our systems, throughout our city, throughout our state. I'll note here, as you see on the slide, it's of course not the only way. There's lots of ways to shape the world that we live in. And this is one of those ways. And so if this is interesting to you, or if the issues that you really care about, and again, as we'll talk later on today, if those issues are really tied to things like the state budget or the city budget, which chances are they may be, it can be helpful to, again, have sort of this framework on how we can influence these processes. Again, there are lots of ways that you can be involved in the movement. Feel free to add some examples of those in the chat. But we do want to make sure that if this is something that you're interested, that you feel like you have the tools and the knowledge to be confident in that process. That's really important to us. And then finally, or one that's at least important to me, when we're talking about elected officials, like, we pay these people, right? Our tax dollars as constituents is what gives them a job, and again, their job is to work for us. And so to me, that is a reason to know this information, because again, decisions are being made that impact me every single day, and I'm at the end of the day paying someone to deal with these issues. So because of all of that, it's really important, again, to me to know who these people are and to know what are the ways that they do their job. So that's why we do this. And so, let's get right into it, right? So as I've talked about before, we're talking about things that maybe you've gone over in your civic education class. If you have, let us know in the chat. I'd be really excited to hear that. But some of this may be entirely new, and that's okay. So we're gonna sort of start at sort of the basic sort of civic level here, and maybe some of this is familiar to you. This is the three branches of government, right? Maybe you heard like a Schoolhouse Rock song about it. I don't know if they still play that in schools, but you know, one of the things you might have learned in history class is that there are these three branches of government, right? The executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And so today we're really going to be focusing on two of them, the executive and the legislature. And we're going to be looking at them at two different levels. We're going to look at them at the state level here in New York, and then we're also going to look at them at the city level. And we are going to look at those two levels of government, and with a particular lens of trying to understand how we might be able to influence them. So I want to keep in mind for you all that, you know, we're not talking about every sort of level of government. If, you know, you're a future lawyer, the judiciary is going to be really important to you, but that's not going to be the focus of today. We're going to be really focusing on ways that young people across the city and state can really have influence over what our lawmakers are doing, whether that's the governor or the mayor in the executive offices, or whether it's the city council or the state legislature. Again, these are people who work for us, and so we want to get a good understanding of the ways that we can influence them. So let's again take a closer look at some of the folks at the state level and try to get an understanding of what exactly the executive and the legislative branches look like. And again, like I said, these might be terms that we're familiar with from school, or maybe you follow them in the news, but we want to make sure that, you know, you're walking away with an idea of what these folks are doing, you know, day to day, when they're doing them, and again, how you might be able to organize and use your voice to create change. So there's a lot of words on this slide. Don't worry about all of them, but I just wanted to give you a sense of who is governing you when we're talking about the state level. So again, we're thinking about the government at the state level. So these are folks representing folks from everywhere, you know, from Flatbush, Brooklyn, where I'm calling in from today, to, you know, North Country, to Rochester, Buffalo, all of it. We're talking about the folks who govern the whole state of New York. And so again, like I mentioned, we're going to be really focusing on how we can influence two of these branches, and that's the executive and the legislative. And so a couple of key pieces here. So when we're talking about the executive branch at the state level, who we're really talking about is the governor. We'll get into more specifics about who our governor is shortly. As folks may know, that has recently changed in New York, which is changing a lot of dynamics that we'll be talking about. But the big takeaway here is that we do have one governor, and the primary goal or job of the governor is overseeing more than 100 state agencies. So every time that, you know, we might work on a legislative campaign, whether it's to increase mental health funding in schools, or to pass climate change rules at the state level, or, you know, increasing financial aid for college students in New York. Ultimately, when we are trying to push legislation on that, what we really want to be happening is like the state agency that's in charge of that issue to actually start working on the issue and to start working on it in the way that we want. And that's ultimately the goal of passing any legislation. And so the fact that the executive branch oversees all of those state agencies is really important if you're building out a legislative campaign, right? Because ultimately they're going to be the person who's, whether it's appointing folks who run state agencies, you know, they're going to be the one who's sort of managing a lot of those folks. And again, there's lots and lots of people in state government. It's not just the case that the governor is always directing every single person, but they have a very large influence over, again, lots of folks in the state government that ultimately are in charge of enacting the things that we want and the vision that we see for our government. Another important thing about the governor here in New York is that whoever's the governor has historically had very big influence over the state budget. And we'll talk about more what that means later on, but that's really important in terms of some of the roles of the governor. The governor also is the person who signs legislation, right? You might have, you know, heard of, you know, a bill making it to the governor's desk and awaiting a signature, and that's when a bill becomes a law. So ultimately, they're sort of the final approver, or, you know, the person who vetoes legislation. So that's an important role that they play. And again, as I mentioned, they are also the person who's overseeing state agencies, which means, again, when you have legislation, ultimately they're going to be the one who's implementing it, and they do that through the agencies that they run. So that's really important. And that's something that sometimes gets overlooked in the policy process, right? You can fight all you want for really great legislation, but if the agency in charge of implementing it isn't, doing a great job at it, that's going to mean limited success for the people it's supposed to benefit. So that's a really important part, right? Because ultimately, if you're here, you're probably wanting to know about how you can shape legislation that delivers on social justice here in New York, and so I think that's a really important part of it as well. And then if you look over at the right-hand side of the screen, you see the slightly bigger blue box, and that's talking a little bit about the legislative branch. Again, lots of information on the screen here. I think an important thing to take away here is that we have two legislative bodies here in New York. So the state legislature is comprised of the state Senate, which is smaller. It has 63 senators. And it's led by a person whose title is the Senate Majority Leader. And again, that's a very powerful role here in New York that we'll talk about in just a little bit. And interestingly, in New York, the state Senate became controlled by Democrats for the first time not that long ago, actually, in 2018. And I bring that up, and sorry about the siren in the background, you know how New York is. But I bring that up because a lot of times folks think about New York as, a very sort of blue state, a state that's controlled by Democrats. And the reality is that that wasn't the case for quite a long time here in New York State. And again, as we'll talk later in this webinar, that some really big shifts have been happening on the state level in terms of party politics, which again is going to change the dynamic and the landscape of advocacy that folks might want to do. And then on the furthest right-hand side here, you see a little piece that says the state assembly. So the state assembly is bigger than the state Senate. There's 150 assembly members, and they're all led by someone who's known as the Speaker of the Assembly. And the assembly has been historically controlled by the Democratic Party for many years. And so, again, compare that to the Senate. And all of those dynamics are really going to change it's going to change, how laws are implemented. I did see a question here in the chat. Will we have access to the presentation? I can send this over to the team at YI, and we can make sure that folks get the slide deck if they RSVP'd. So as long as you're RSVP'd, we'll make sure that you get a copy of this. So happy to do that. Oh, and then just like a fun fact, in case you're a policy nerd, which if you can't tell, that might kind of include me, that technically because we have these two legislative bodies, the Senate and the Assembly, that means we have what's known as a bicameral legislature. So bi as in two. So in case you're really feeling dweeby, that's some good information for you. So again, that's a lot of information there, but now we can transition into thinking a little bit about when our state elected officials in Albany are actually making laws. When are they making the laws that impact, again, our day-to-day lives? So the answer to that is up on the screen. So this is actually the legislative calendar. This comes out every single year. The state assembly puts this out to let folks know when lawmakers are working. So if you see here, this is actually for this previous year. So this was for 2021, the year that we're still in. But an important thing to note is that lawmakers are up in Albany really for about 6 months out of the year. They do, work outside of those 6 months. They're in their district offices. So they're in, if they are an elected official from Buffalo, they're in their Buffalo office. They're meeting with constituents. They're meeting with advocates like yourselves. They're preparing for the next legislative session. But if we're talking about the time period when elected officials are in Albany, passing legislation, passing budgets, then that's really something that happens 6 months out of the year. And that happens from the beginning of January through June. And so again, we're looking at what the calendar looked like this current cycle that we just went through. And so this will be updated in 2022. But these blue days are the days when lawmakers are actually working on legislation. And I know that when I saw this for the first time, I was sort of surprised. So it doesn't seem like that many days. If you wanted to like count the number of them, you could count the number and see that that's not a ton of time to influence the legislative process. So it can be an intense time period. But again, it's one that can deliver important changes for your community. And so I think that's something important to keep in mind. This calendar applies to both the Senate and the Assembly. So whether you're in a senator or whether you're in the Assembly, you are going to be in Albany, again, working on legislation, trying to get things to pass from January to June. So that is really the focus of them during that time period. I also want to acknowledge that Jonathan put in a really good point in the chat about not forgetting that there's a referendum on the number of senators who are going to be in New York State. So Jonathan, if you want to share any information about that in the chat with folks, I welcome you to do so. That's in reference to a ballot initiative that'll be on the November ballot if you live here in New York. So really good point. Again, our political system changes constantly. So I think that's one of the ways that happens. So again, that's when folks are working. And so in those blue days, when they're in session, and again, I should mention here that some of these really helpful slides come from a nonprofit called the Advocacy Institute, which is based here in New York. Maybe Lisa or Neha, if you want to link to them in the chat, I think that would be great. But that can be a really helpful resource if you really want to dig into this more. If there's things that we're not able to cover on this call, I encourage you to check them out. They're a really great resource. That being said, so again, on those blue days in the session, what is really happening there? So typically during session, folks may be in Albany, sometimes on Mondays, definitely on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Lawmakers are in the Capitol. They are meeting with their staff. They're meeting with other folks in their political party, which is what's called as conference. They're meeting in their committees, and that's a big part of what's happening there. And then on that Friday, they typically leave Albany and they are back in their home district. So again, if you're a representative, say, or you're an assembly member from the Hudson Valley, like you're back in, whatever town that your home district is in. And again, you may be meeting with your staff, you're working with your constituents, all of that good stuff. But again, during session, it's really those first couple of days of the week that they're really focused on passing legislation. And I'm curious, like in the chat, if folks have any experience going up to Albany during session, to definitely let us know. Tell us a little bit about what that was like. If you've been to the Capitol before during session, was it crowded? What was going on? What were your meetings like? Did you go to a rally? There's all sorts of stuff that happens during the legislative session, and it's always interesting to hear about folks' experience. So feel free to share those in the chat if that is relevant to you. So again, when I showed you those 6 months there, when the state government is really working on legislation and the budget, like I mentioned, it doesn't mean that work isn't happening outside of those times. So right now we are in a period that's known as off session. And so that's from July to December. And in those times, Monday through Friday, they are in their home districts, which means, again, they're meeting with their constituents. They might be fundraising for their next election. They are working on developing their priorities for the next year. Maybe they're helping people who live in their district apply to some of these programs that maybe they passed in the last year's state session. So one big example of that, folks might be familiar with the Excluded Workers Fund, which was an emergency relief program that set aside money for undocumented New Yorkers who were prevented from getting some COVID relief money due to their immigration status from the federal government. And so, now that legislation, that was major legislation that passed last year, again, thanks to the advocacy of a lot of groups across New York, including a lot of young people. But now that they're off session, and have already passed that legislation, there might be lawmakers who are now spending some of their time helping their constituents apply to some of those programs. So just to give you a sense of what folks are doing outside of those 6 months. So as I've mentioned a couple of times this afternoon, one of the most important things, and one of the most important laws that the state passes every year is the budget. And a lot of times folks think about the budget as something entirely separate from passing a law, when in actuality, the state budget is a law. It's just a big, giant law. And it's one that has to pass every single year, right? So say, I want to pass a law on, on bike lanes and making more protected bike lanes in New York. That doesn't have to pass every year, but the budget does have to pass. So it's a law that must be passed every single year. There's rules about that in our state constitution. And it's a really big deal. And it takes up a lot of time for state lawmakers. So again, this is that same calendar that we looked at before, referring to the 6 months a year that lawmakers are actually making legislation, passing legislation in the Capitol. And so I want you to pay attention to the red boxes and the purple boxes. So if you can see the red boxes on the screen, that's in reference to the time in the session where folks are really, really, really laser focused on the state budget. So if you're an advocate and you go up to Albany, maybe you're coming from New York, you're taking, a several-hour bus ride and you're trying to make some change at the state level, and you say, I want to, pass this bill, and here I've got it written out, you're not going to necessarily want to come in during the time in red here. And the reason is because folks are really, really focused on passing the budget. And as we'll talk about, the budget is huge for New York State. We have one of the biggest budgets in the country. It's larger than the budgets of several nations. And so there's a lot of stuff that goes in there. So, that's part of the reason why so much of the calendar is really spent on the budget itself. So again, as advocates, it's important for us to remember that we really, part of the reason we want to impart this information for you is that, again, if this is a process that you want to be a part of, that you can feel confident that you're coming in at the sort of the right time period, and that you can be strategic in when you're making the asks, because all of that is going to increase the likelihood that the things that you care about pass. And if you're here today, I'm sort of assuming that's important to you. So I want to make sure you have those tools. So after the budget passes, which is, typically April 1st, is when the state budget must pass. That's sometimes it does go over. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But after the state budget passes, you'll see that there's still some more days in the legislative session here, right? So take a look at the purple boxes that you see on the screen. And that's when lawmakers are focused on passing legislation outside of the budget, right? So maybe there's legislation you want to pass that doesn't really have to do with funding something, but maybe it's about changing a particular rule or changing a particular law. So an example of that is, think about the difference between pushing for more state financial aid, which is probably going to be a budget ask, so something you're going to want to think about in these red boxes, versus passing rules or passing laws about protections for folks with student debt. Some of those protections aren't necessarily going to be about allocating money towards something, but about rules that colleges or other groups might have to abide by. So that would be an example of standalone legislation, is what it's sometimes referred to as. And that just means legislation that's passed outside of the budget process. So that's going to happen, or folks are really going to be concentrated on that in these time periods that are marked here in purple. So again, we just want to make sure that you know that, so that, in case this is something that you want to do, that you kind of know sort of the right time of the year to be doing some of these things. So moving on. So I've made reference to the fact that the state budget is quite big. And now I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how big. So the state budget is huge. I'm gonna say that like 3 more times today, but it is really, really big. And the actual number this past year was $212 billion. That's billion with a B. That's a lot of money. And that's a lot of money that's, as we're going to talk about, impacts a lot of things that we care about. And so again, this is another really helpful slide, I think, from the Advocacy Institute, which, full transparency, I also facilitate with them. But the state budget is larger than the entire budgets of several countries combined. So when we're talking about money here, we're talking about a lot of money. And again, a lot of money that can, go to, certain programs that we might care about more than others. And so I think it's important to have, just how much money we're talking about in mind when we talk about budget campaigns. So I've made mention and reference a couple of times this evening about, making the case that there are a lot of things in the state budget that impact us as young people, that impact us as New Yorkers, as college students, as parents, as undocumented folks, whoever you are, there's something in the budget that is going to, sort of impact you or your community. And so I have some examples up here on the screen, and so we're thinking about everything from mental health counselors in campus to programs like CUNY ASAP, which provides free tuition and individualized support and Metro cards to eligible CUNY students, to everything like financial aid, how much financial aid you receive. That's in part influenced by the state budget. So there's a lot of stuff on here specifically around college, just knowing that's where a lot of our folks are and a lot of what our folks are working on. But as you see on the screen, plenty of things that also impact young people that, aren't about colleges, right? So everything from immigration services and healthcare, climate change programs, certainly that's something that impacts younger folks, folks of all ages, as well as, again, some of those emergency funds that we talked about for undocumented workers. So, the list goes on and on. Again, if you think about $212 billion, there are a lot of things in there that could impact our communities. If you have ideas about some of the things that might be in the budget, welcome you to share those in the chat. But what this slide is really trying to communicate is that, again, it can feel like this big, nebulous, confusing process. In a lot of ways, it is. I won't lie to you there. But again, the reason why we care about any of this is it is really impacting the things that we care about from day to day. So I just wanted to try to make that clear, that, again, things that are really important to us in our communities are definitely going to be in that budget. So very quickly, I just wanted to show this is another way of thinking about what lawmakers are doing year round. I already showed you those 6 months that folks are in session. We've made reference to what they're doing at different points of the year. But again, here is just a different way of looking at that. And so let's take a look at where we are right now. So it is October, which means we are technically in the start of budget season. And what that means is in October, this is when the governor and their folks are really starting to think about what are our priorities in the budget. They are meeting with agencies. They're looking into how things were funded the previous year, and they're starting to flesh out what some of their priorities are. So that's really something that's happening, again, largely in the executive branch at this point. But again, folks in the legislature are certainly also planning that. They're meeting with other lawmakers, they're meeting with their constituents, they're meeting with advocacy groups, they're meeting with lobbyists, and starting to think about some of the priorities that are happening there. So even when folks are not in the in legislative session, even when they're not in Albany, that budget process is already happening. And again, just take a look at how much of that full calendar year is really focused on the budget, which should give you a sense of just how important it is. So here in New York, 3 people have the most influence over the state budget. and I sort of referenced some of them earlier. But these three people are the governor, so that is now Kathy Hochul, who replaced Governor Cuomo at the end of August after he left office. So she is the newest person on the screen here. But then there's also two other folks, and so these are the legislative leaders. So we have the Senate Majority Leader, Andrew Stewart Cousins, and then we have Carl Heastie, who's the Speaker of the Assembly. And so there's a term that's sometimes used in New York that's called three people in a room. It used to be called three men in a room when it was only men who were in these roles. Obviously, that has since changed. But these are going to be the folks who, when we get to April 1 and we're really sort of hammering down the state budget, these are going to be the folks who have the most influence over the budget. So keep that in mind. That being said, the governor has like the most influence over the state budget. I said the most on here. And again, part of that is in our state constitution. It's been decided through court cases and all of that. But the governor really does have a lot of control when it comes to the state budget. And the reason is if we, again, think about those 6 months of the year where lawmakers are in Albany, right in January, that's when the governor has what's known as the state of the state. And that's when the governor is listing out their priorities for the next budget. And so the governor kind of gets to have the first proposal of, here's what I think we should spend, those hundreds of billions of dollars on this year. And here's where I think that we should, try to raise money so that we can fund these programs. The governor gets a lot of say in shaping what that looks like. And again, the legislature gets to respond. They can nitpick over different pieces of it, but largely it's going to be the governor who has a lot of control over this process. And that's, I think that's really important, especially thinking about, that we have a new governor, and we have a governor who we don't know exactly yet what she'll prioritize and what she won't. So in the past administration, under the Cuomo administration, the governor was a Democrat, but largely a fiscally conservative one. And so what that means is there are a lot of ways where, he would cut certain things in the budget, or, decline to sort of raise revenue by, say, raising taxes on the ultra wealthy in New York. There was a lot of hesitancy from Governor Cuomo to do some of those things, which certainly changed the landscape for students and everyday people and advocates and coalitions who were trying to get more investment into certain programs. And so with these new people coming in, and with the new governor, we don't know if she'll follow that same roadmap as Cuomo. Things like financial aid in New York, really saw some pretty serious cuts, or didn't get very big increases as tuition continued to increase here in New York. And so we don't know if the governor will sort of follow suit, or if she'll take another approach to funding things. That's going to be something really important to keep an eye on over the next couple of months. As I made reference to in previous slides, our state capital has changed a lot over the last couple of years. I mean, even over just a few months, there's been some really seismic shifts in who some of our state leaders are. And I think one takeaway I want you to have from that is that changes the landscape of, again, how some of these programs get funded, and which programs are funded, how much money they get, all of that. That can be changed based on who's in office. And it's not just at the executive level. We've seen, again, over the last 3 years, with the various state elections, we've seen more younger people be elected to state office. We've seen more people of color get elected to state office. We've seen, more progressives or socialists get elected to office. And that's, again, going to change the landscape. It's going to change who we might want to work with on particular issues. But also, I say all that with an asterisk, because, our systems are, they're not necessarily built for change. So even as new folks come into office, there's lots of processes that they have to navigate that, can limit some of the sort of transformative change that maybe they ran for office on or campaigned about. So that's something to keep in mind as well. So something else to think about here, and again, looking at the slide, is that all of our three levels of government, right? So again, stepping back, thinking about sort of your, middle school civics education class, you might remember that we have, the federal government, we have the state government, and then we have our local government. That's sort of the structure of how governance works in the US. And I think an important thing to remember is that what happens at each level of government is going to impact what the fight looks like on the state or the city side of things. So the federal budget and what happens there then is going to impact what's happening with the state budget, which is then going to impact what's happening with the city budget. And the reason is because, again, revenue. So money is going to come from the federal government for particular things that then goes to the state. But once the state sees how much money they have coming in, then they can really start to build out the budget. And then once the city sees how much money is coming in from the state, then that's going to impact their budget. So remembering that these things are connected, again, that's really important, because if we see, in the news, proposed cuts for, the federal government or the state government or things like that, that's going to then impact us if we're working on budget campaigns at either the state and city level. So I want to spend a little bit of time here focusing on the city budget here, which again, we see that the city is really influenced by these other two levels of government. And so again, when we're talking about the New York City budget, it is also a very large budget, particularly for a city, which is perhaps not surprising given that we are indeed the largest city in the United States. But just to put some numbers to that. So again, we already talked about how last year's budget, or this year's budget at the state level is $212 billion. And the city budget is about half of that. That's $98.6 billion. So again, tons and tons of money that we're talking about. And as the slide points out, that's about the annual budget of the entire nation of Portugal, which again, just puts into perspective how much of our collective resources we're talking about when we talk about the city budget. So this slide is going to look familiar. You're even going to see some of the same terms in here. But again, if you remember that slide from just a couple of slides back, talking about the connection between the federal budget to the state budget to the city budget, you'll see that again, what money comes from one level is then therefore going to impact what happens at the other levels. But there are plenty of things in the city budget that directly impact young folks. And again, if you have ideas about what some of those may be, I welcome you to include those in the chat. But a couple of important things to name here that might be even a little more different than what happens on the state level. So there's particular scholarship programs that are funded at the city level for New York City students. There are particular city council initiatives that are funded, like a food insecurity program that exists at CUNY now. That's been funded by the city council in the city budget. Another big one that's definitely been big in the last several years has been the Summer Youth Employment Program. Again, if you've had any familiarity with that program, definitely let us know in the chat. But that was a big focus of a lot of student-led advocacy over the last 2 years, is really making sure that in COVID, funding for paid summer youth jobs wasn't cut. And we actually saw some pretty big expansions to that program, not what all the advocates wanted, but we saw some major expansions to that program in COVID, which is a pretty big deal. And I think it's really a testament to what can happen when young people sort of work collaboratively to shape the budget. That was really led by a lot of young people, and groups like Teens Take Charge and all sorts of groups who came together to push for that. Something else that's not necessarily listed on the screen right now is policing. Of course, young people in New York are very much impacted by policing, and that's something, again, that is largely funded at the city level. And again, something that a lot of young people have been very active about in in recent years. And so I see some folks in the chat sharing their own personal experience with navigating these systems, seeing that Jonathan went to Albany with State Senator Liz Krueger. That's pretty amazing, very intense. If you want to share a little bit about what your day was like, happy to hear it. And Chris was a site director at SYP, and also your first job was because of SYP. That's awesome. So happy to hear that. I just see a couple questions in the chat here. So is it safe to say that you can lobby for an issue whenever, but in reality, it can't be passed until the first half of the year? Yeah, so I guess how I would respond to that is, in reality, the budget is, or I'll put it this way, advocacy around these issues happens year long, right? Because as we looked at some of those maps before, of some of those diagrams of the timeline, that even though lawmakers are really focused on passing the budget and legislation at the state level from January to July, we know that all year round, they're hearing from constituents, they're hearing from advocacy groups, they're hearing from lobbyists about what some of those priorities should be. And so while it's true that if part of your goal is to pass legislation, it is true that that is really, for the most part, only going to be happening between January and the end of June or mid-June. It doesn't mean that that's only when your campaign should be happening. And actually, the strongest campaigns start earlier, right? So we talked about how October is really when folks in the governor's office and in the legislature start thinking about what some of their budget priorities might be. And so if you're a campaign, you really want to, even now in October, you want to be like finding out ways to meet with folks in, the executive offices. You want to find out ways that you might be able to influence them and say, hey, I think it's really important that you fund mental health counselors. And again, we're going to have future sessions on really how to develop those asks. So definitely stay tuned and join us for those. But so my answer is yes, legislation largely only happens during that first pass of the year, but strong campaigns really need to happen all year round. We also had a question about that $212 billion question. Is that for the years 2021 and 2022, or was that improved for? So yeah, that number is in reference to programs for 2021 and 2022. So thanks again for those great questions. Feel free to keep them coming. So again, on the city level, just wanted to share with y'all. So we see that it's a little bit different than at the state level. So one of the ways you can tell that is by looking at this dark blue line here. And that's, again, when folks in city council are meeting at the council, they are working on passing legislation and, are passing bills. And so, again, compared to those 6 months in Albany, we see that the city is meeting from September 1st to the end of June on passing legislation. And about half of that time, or half that year, is really spent focused on the budget. So you see that the budget season in New York City starts around the same time as the state, but then it really it goes a little bit longer. It runs until June 30th. And again, the reason for that is thinking about that slide that shows the different sort of levels of government is because the city can't really pass a budget until they know how much money is coming into coming from the state. And so the city is sort of the last one standing when it comes to passing, again, that nearly $100 billion budget. So that gives you a bit of sense of when lawmakers are working. So we see that they are currently in session now. So they're working on passing bills, but they're also, we're going to start seeing people preparing for budget season relatively soon. And what's interesting about that is, again, we talked about some of these big seismic changes that are happening in terms of who some of our elected officials are at the state level. We are about to see a huge number of new folks in the city. And again, I always want to give that caveat of just because there's new folks coming in doesn't mean that it's going to become radically easier to pass some of the things that we really care about. But again, it's going to change, the possibility of passing certain things. It's going to change who you're working with. And again, if you build a tight campaign, it could change the possibility of some of these things passing. But again, we're talking about large changes here in New York. And part of the reason for that is there's an upcoming election. So folks may know that there was primaries back in June for the mayor, for your city council member, for the comptroller, for the public advocate, all sorts of important roles in New York City. And so we have the primaries in June, and now we're coming in November, there will be the election to choose ultimately the candidates for those office. And so that election will happen in November. In January, we have a new mayor. We're going to have lots and lots and lots of new people in city council. We're going to have tons of new elected officials, new staff coming in. And so it'll be the first budget cycle for the new mayor, for the new city council. So again, it's going to be an interesting time. I think some of the patterns and dynamics of the last several years of budgets are going to look a little different. And so it's going to be something new for us to keep our eyes on as advocates. Again, more sort of helpful information from the great folks at the Advocacy Institute around what's really happening in that sort of orange, dark orange line over here. Again, lots of sort of things on the screen here. I don't expect you to memorize all of these. Again, we'll share out slides at a later date. But just a couple of things to keep in mind that, some big milestones of the budget cycle here in New York City is that, again, similarly to the state level, it all sort of starts with the executive, right? The mayor, much like the state level, the governor has a lot of power over the budget. At the city level, the mayor has a lot of power over the budget. And think about it as sort of like doing a group project for school, right? If you have one person in your group who comes in and says, hey, we had to write a 9-page report and I already wrote 8 pages of it. What do you think? You're going to be more editing and tinkering rather than developing the whole thing. And that's kind of what happens at the city and state level. The executive gets a lot of leeway in sort of setting what they think the budget should be. And then, the council and the borough presidents, which is what that BP stands for, they get to make recommendations. They get to sort of negotiate on the budget. But largely the mayor has a lot of control over it. And again, one of the ways that the council can sort of influence the budget is there's all sorts of hearings that happen about how things were funded before, were things funded enough? And that's a way, and I'll just note here that that's a space where folks, everyday folks can, again, go to those hearings and let their voices be heard and influence that process. And if you've ever testified before, definitely let us know in the chat. And again, we've talked a little bit about how the city's leaders are changing in just a couple of weeks. So again, just a quick reminder, the elections are coming up. If you want to vote absentee, you got to sign up before the 18th. We're happy to share some of these links afterwards with y'all, but just a reminder that that election is coming up and not a lot of folks vote in it. So if you are someone who can vote, we definitely encourage you to do so. And a reminder that even if you can't vote in New York, due to your age or immigration status, there's still ways to influence local elections. If you can think of any examples of those, feel free to put them in the chat. But you can volunteer for different candidates. You can phone bank, you can text bank, you can encourage people to vote. You can participate in participatory budgeting. There's all sorts of things that you may be able to do regardless of age or immigration status. So keep that in mind as we come into this next major election cycle. And so again, we can share some of the links later, but with all of this information and information about these processes, again, we're going to have more trainings getting into more details on these folks, but I do want to just make a note here that, it's really important that, again, if you're trying to influence these sorts of, legislative campaigns, if you're trying to influence the budget, you got to know who some of these people are. And so definitely encourage you to find out who your elected officials are. And, we can provide a link, maybe Lisa or Neha, you can drop the mygov.nyc.org link in the chat. You just put in your address and you can find out who some of your elected officials are. Again, at the city level, there's a good chance that some of that will be changing, but just to give you a sense of who some of those people are. And this is a literal picture of my refrigerator. And so this is just a plug that once you find out who these people are, that's great to know. But it's also good to, actually, start to develop some relationships with folks, and, be in regular communication, because again, we are paying these people is part of what motivates me. And so I am an unabashed dweeb, and I actually have their phone numbers on my refrigerator, so that if there's something happening, if there's an issue in the bike lane near my house, or if I want them to vote a particular way on the budget, that I have that information handy. So, think about ways that you might be able to build this into your everyday life. So again, we are running close to time here. And so again, I hope this was helpful for y'all. I really appreciate the questions that folks included in the chat here. And again, there's all sorts of ways that you can learn about the budget priorities of your elected officials. One thing I'll say very quickly is once you find out who these people are, follow them on social media. They are super active on social media. They are super responsive. And that's one of the ways that you can start to figure out what are some of the things that they're talking about again and again. And that'll give you an idea of what those priorities are. And you can also then start thinking about developing campaigns that'll influence those priorities, which again is going to be the topic of future trainings. So very quickly, before we wrap today, I just wanted to name a couple of key takeaways that again, our local and our state budgets, they do have a major impact on our communities, but they can be confusing and difficult to understand. And so one thing that I will strongly recommend is working with other folks if this is something that you're interested in, whether it's your student government, whether it's clubs that you're a part of, whether it's community groups, whether it's advocacy organizations like Young Invincibles. Finding folks to partner with can be really helpful when navigating budgets. And again, there's a lot of political changes that are happening in New York that can create opportunities to, again, fund and pass legislation that we really care about. But I will always say that change is not a guarantee, and it's really about how we interact with these systems that is going to create change. Sometimes that comes through legislative advocacy, that can come through protest, it can come through strikes, it can come through all sorts of ways. But again, change is not a guarantee. So somehow we've reached the end of the session. And again, I thank you all for staying with us today. It's been really great to have you here. Again, keep an eye on your email for any additional links, information, and of course, information about the raffle. One of you just won $100, so excited for that. And again, we really encourage you to join us for the next training on Thursday, October 28th. Which will be led by my wonderful colleague here, Neha, and that's going to be on campus level, basic needs, advocacy, and outreach. So again, how students right now are creating change right on their campuses to make sure that folks have access to food and housing and mental health and all of the things that every single person needs in order to fully succeed. So we hope to see you there. And again, thank you for coming out. We really appreciate you taking the time today. And again, stay connected with Young Invincibles. You can follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and we hope to see you soon. So again, thanks for taking the time this afternoon, and we'll see you soon. And thanks, Diana. It's so good to see you in the chat, and thanks everybody else for joining us today. We're really happy to have you here, and we hope to see you soon.